Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Abraham Lowenthal. Abe is founding director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program. He also founded the Inter-American Dialogue and the Pacific Council on International Policy. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Southern California and is also author of the new report we're going to be talking about today. The title of that report is Venezuela in 2023 and Beyond, Charting a New Course. Abe Lowenthal, welcome to Wilson Center Now. Great to have you back at the center, even if only virtually.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be back.
So before we dive into some of your analysis and conclusions, tell me about the Venezuela Working Group and how this all came about.
I'm glad you start with that question, because although I am the author in the sense that somebody has to drive the narrative through to the end, this is really a product of an 18-member working group composed of very knowledgeable top people in the field, both scholars and practitioners, people who've had high government positions in non-governmental organizations, and professors and researchers from several countries, from different generations and genders and disciplines and backgrounds, all of them first-rate people. The working group was organized by Cindy Arnson in her period as director of the Latin American program, and it issued a report about a year or 14 months ago in which the author, in the same sense, was Michael Penfold, an outstanding Venezuelan social scientist who is a member of this year's group as well and has played an important role. And that report attracted attention, focusing on really trying to analyze and explain how Venezuela got to be such a difficult situation, and recommending in general terms some ways of looking at the situation to help understand why it was so difficult and to sort of look in the right direction. After that report circulated and was widely discussed, Cindy convened with Michael a small group to decide what to do next. And the answer was to try to organize another year's effort by the Venezuela Working Group, adding some people. Some people were ready to move on to other things. We chose to add some greater diversity in terms of backgrounds and experiences into the group, and some different perspectives, because we set out to answer the question, is it possible for people who really understand the Venezuelan situation well, who understand authoritarian governments, and who understand previous transitions from authoritarian governments to democracy, is it possible for such people to reach agreement on how Venezuela should be approached now, after several years of this dictatorship, several years of failed efforts really to change the situation there, deterioration economically, socially, health-wise, in terms of the way the society works, human rights violations, a really messy situation. Can we think of ways to approach it and reach agreement on the best way to do so? That was the challenge. I was invited to chair the group and to be the principal author.
Well, thank you for that background. What it tells me is a lot of brain power behind this report. And how difficult or easy was it for the group to reach some consensus on this really challenging question?
The first step was to determine through a couple of Zoom seminars, webinars, and we were able to connect people in Europe and South America, as well as the United States, to discuss these things. We pretty quickly reached a consensus that the approach the Venezuelan democratic opposition was taking, which was supported by U.S. policy in different ways, first under the previous administration, previous to Trump, and then under the Trump administration, and more recently in the Biden administration, that approach was not working. On the contrary, things were going in the wrong direction from the standpoint of the kind of values that we have. When I speak of values we have, we're all Democrats with a small d. We believe in democracy. We believe in the protection of human rights. We believe in respectful international relations in which countries can and will have different interests, and they have to be reconciled in some way or managed in some way in all cases, even with the closest allies, the United States and Britain or Canada, and all the more so in a situation like Venezuela. But that the approach being taken, which had been for the US government to withdraw diplomatic recognition for Venezuela, through diplomatic skill and pressure of various kinds, including economic pressures, to assemble a group of almost 60 governments around the world to join the United States in not recognizing the Venezuelan government, to support the so-called interim government, which the opposition had set up through a reasoning process that allowed the democratically elected National Assembly, which has already finished its term, to appoint a provisional government, a tentative government, an interim government, and to appoint an attractive young political leader to be its president, to recognize that president, and to sort of kind of try to manage the relationship on the basis of that construct. The construct didn't work because the president, Juan Guaido, an attractive and energetic person with vision and so on, he started out with a tremendous burst of enthusiasm for a new face and for a new approach, but he wasn't able really to produce much change, and some of the change produced was negative. And the fact was that the so-called interim government controlled not a square inch of Venezuelan territory, controlled no possibility of organizing programs in Venezuela. It was a so-called government in exile, which relied on the policy that the Trump administration pushed, which was maximum pressure to try to force the Venezuelan government to make concessions and eventually to disappear. President Trump himself spoke of all options being on the table, including military intervention, something which was really not true. It wasn't really on the table because neither the Defense Department nor the State Department nor the intelligence agencies were in favor of it, but it created a polarization, and the interim government was really never able to make progress.
And essentially, Maduro's hand has been strengthened since then.
So we began with a consensus that you needed an alternative.
Yeah.
And that the Maduro government was the government of Venezuela and had to be dealt with that way. It doesn't mean that you have to treat them as best friends, but by all means. And so then we began working together on, okay, well, what is the sort of correlation of forces? What does the opposition have going for it? What does the government of Venezuela have going for it? What are their respective aims and their respective fears and difficulties? And began to really discuss among ourselves whether there are any points in common that you could work on as things that all Venezuelans want, whether they're supporting the government or subject to it, living in Venezuela or in exile perhaps. And by the way, there's a tremendous Venezuelan exile as a result of the problems there. 7.1 million Venezuelans, about a third of the country's population, has left the country. The United States, I think, is the fourth or fifth largest recipient of Venezuelan refugees, and that's beginning to take a toll on domestic politics in the United States in terms of the border, so on and so forth. And so Colombia, which is the immediate neighbor, has a tremendous number of, so everybody's affected by this. Anyway, the fact is that during the last couple of years, there was an initiative by the Norwegian government to set up a negotiating process. The Norwegians have had a tremendous amount of experience. Their sort of foreign policy role in the world has been to try to resolve difficult issues. You remember that they sponsored the Oslo talks between Israel and the Palestinian organization and so on. Anyway, they started a process which developed some common lines of thinking between the government and the opposition. And they came out with a memorandum of understanding, which listed, I don't remember the number, maybe a dozen or 15 things that they would try to accomplish in terms of objectives. And we looked at those and said, you know, considering how these people have been at each other tooth and nail, it's amazing that they can reach agreement on 15 or whatever the number was, concrete things that they're in favor of, and that they hammered out with the Norwegian facilitators. Why don't we start with that as an important finding, that these people actually can agree on some things, and some of them are pretty obvious why you would agree on it. For example, if there's famine, they agree on food. Mm-hmm. And if there's destruction of medical facilities and there's no medicines of very important kinds, they agree on the need to get access to those medicines and so on. So we sort of said, let's look at the things they agree on and figure out whether there aren't ways of facilitating those through international cooperation, and begin a process of trying to work step by step on resolving Venezuela's problems, looking for appropriate roles for the international community, including the United States, Latin American countries, and others, realizing that the Venezuelans will have to do the heavy lifting, because you can't resolve these problems from outside and just say, well, this is what you got to do. This is their country. But that we probably needed to get out of the business of making believe that there was another government in Venezuela that were our friends, rather treat them as the political opposition in the country. And beginning with that, we began to really look at a lot of specifics and to propose a way of approaching negotiations, which would recognize, on the basis of the experience not only of Venezuela, but of a lot of other countries, and I want to come back to that, to look at what the process might look like, and to understand that a process of going from where Venezuela is now to a Venezuela that has respect for human rights, democratic governance, alternability in power and elections, that also has a recovered economy, that also has functioning institutions of the different branches of government, checks and balances, an independent judiciary that runs elections on a free and fair, honest basis that can be internationally monitored and so on. To do all of those things, it's not going to happen through any negotiation from one day to the next. It took a few years for Venezuela to deteriorate as much as it has now. And it's going to take a few years for it to recover from where it is now.
What do you say? Let me ask you a question, though, a lot about those expectations and the notion. The report makes clear that I think you introduced the term strategic patience, maybe as an alternative to maximum pressure. But for those who are harsh critics of an authoritarian ruler, Nicolas Maduro, how do you convince them that this is the proper path, that it's going to take time and there is no flipping of a light switch, and that if this is going to change, it's going to be a slog?
I mentioned earlier, and I said I wanted to come back to it, that there have been previous cases of transitions from authoritarian rule to democratic governance. And one of the reasons I think I was invited to take the role of chairing the group for this year was that I did a big project. I won't take but a couple of minutes to mention it, but I think it's very relevant. Did a good project jointly with Sergio Bitar, an outstanding Chilean public intellectual and political leader who's been 3 times in Chile's cabinet, wonderful guy. He and I were invited by an international organization to do a study of successful democratic transitions by interviewing 13 former presidents in 9 countries in Latin America, Africa, Europe, and Asia, who had successfully made transitions, either from being themselves part of an authoritarian government, like de Klerk in South Africa, or the Polish president representing the Communist Party in that situation, or various others, or by being opposition leaders who organized the democratic opposition. And so we had some of each. And in some cases, like Mandela and de Klerk, it took outstanding leadership on both sides to make it work. But we looked at these 9 cases and we interviewed each of these people face to face and had, several hours with each of these people, probing, how did you get from an authoritarian government with monopoly of force? You didn't have your own army. They had the army and the police, etc. How did you manage to get this thing changed? And we really learned a lot of lessons from that. And when I got into working on Venezuela, it was with the idea, maybe some of the things that have been learned in other places might be relevant in Venezuela. When we were doing the study, and we would go to talk to somebody like Gonzalez in Spain or Maciejewski in Poland or whatever, almost every time the person we were talking to would say, well, I don't know how much use you're going to get from our case because our situation was unique. It wasn't really like, we had some very special circumstances. And the fact is that every one of these is special. And every one of these, it was an uphill slog for the democratic opposition to get to power. It wasn't an easy thing. It wasn't something you could point and say, well, you just do these 3 things and in 6 months it's solved. It took years. And so we came from that to your point. That is, how do you convince people that this is possible to have an authoritarian government that either becomes less authoritarian or transfers power to an interim government that goes in a different direction, or that organizes elections which it manages to lose. You take that last thing, for example. It's implausible for an authoritarian government to run an election and lose. It's implausible. They control all the mechanisms of government. But it has happened time and again. In Chile, the constitution that Pinochet, the dictator, imposed on the country called for a plebiscite at the end of 8 years of his presidency with one simple question: do you authorize the government to have another 8 years, yes or no? Well, they weren't supposed to lose that plebiscite, but the opposition organized itself well enough. It had some international support in many ways as well, but they won the plebiscite. They won the plebiscite in a narrow vote, 52 to 48. And you really weren't sure on the night that they won the election that it was going to hold. I mean, still, the authoritarian government controls everything. They lost an election. Who says they don't just say, well, we don't like the election? Well, the head of the Air Force went on television half an hour after the results were announced and said, the armed forces of Chile understands the results of the election and respects the popular decision. Pinochet probably was not going to accept that result, but the armed forces reached that decision. So you wouldn't have predicted that necessarily, but things happen when you try them out. So similarly, in some other cases, in Poland, the round table negotiations between the Polish Communist Party and the opposition led to, as the opposition got more and more popular, street demonstrations and so on and so forth, you got to the situation where they decided to negotiate and to agree on an electoral system in which there would be two houses, like a Senate and a House, and the rules would be different for how you get the majority and so on in each, as we have it here.
Mm-hmm.
And it was set up in such a way as to intentionally give a quasi assurance that the Communist Party would win the upper house election, but it would be much more competitive in the lower house. And then, lo and behold, the opposition, Solidarity, won both elections. They won even in the Senate. So what happens then? Well, Solidarity, the opposition to the communist government, offered the Communist Party the positions of Secretary of Defense and Chief of the National Police to the Communist Party as a way of compromising. They would take power, they would have the presidency, they would have the other important positions, but the Communist Party would still have control of the defense structure and the police. Well, that's not a perfect democratic solution, but it's a transitional solution that allowed Poland to move in a direction which has not been reversed in all these years. So with those kinds of insights in mind, we've been admiring what the Norwegians have been doing to push things along in negotiations of those, the memorandum of understanding that I mentioned. We've been taking that into account. We've been taking experiences of other, and we've been thinking about, how do you approach negotiations realistically with a time frame that is extended, with a step-by-step approach, beginning with things that really reasonable people ought to be able to agree on, like humanitarian assistance, like assurances that the judiciary will be not controlled by the executive, but independent, that the institutions that Venezuela used to have for democratic governance get re-energized and perhaps reshaped in some ways. And following sort of that methodology, we have come up with what I think is a coherent, activist, democratic approach that is respectful of the fact that there is a government, that is respectful of human rights and democratic governance, and that holds out ways of moving incrementally and relies on the United States with its very considerable economic sanctions that it has put on Venezuela, which have been crippling in a number of ways, including humanitarian. It puts the United States in the situation of being part of this effort through governmental efforts, because it can decide if the Venezuelan government does A, B, C, it will let go of one particular part of the sanctions, and it won't come back to them unless those agreements to do 1, 2, 3 are grossly violated. And so you've got then a process. And I think it makes a lot of sense. People we've talked to in different quarters in the United States, in Venezuela, in Latin America, there's another interesting change in the situation. When we began this, there were most of the neighbors in Latin America of Venezuela were very hostile to the Maduro government. The Maduro government comes out of a left background and tradition. It called itself socialism for the 21st century. It's really dropped that lingo. It hardly ever mentions socialism, and they don't have any real socialist economy. But still, it comes out of the left tradition and certainly very close to Cuba in that sense. In the last year and a half, people coming out of a democratic left tradition, not a totalitarian left tradition, not an authoritarian left tradition, but a democratic left transition, have taken power through elections in Chile, in Colombia, and in Brazil. And these are people who know how to run a government with a social conscience, with a view toward equity and recognition of difference and divergence and so on and so forth. These are emblematic of those kind of values. But they follow democracy. They believe in it, partly because they went through authoritarian periods. And so they know what the costs are. So Lula in Brazil, for example, who's very much in the news for other reasons these days, but he is somebody who can talk to Maduro and his colleagues with a great deal of authority, as somebody who you would never have believed 25 years ago that he was ever going to be president of Brazil. He's now been elected for the third time president of Brazil. And he's a Democrat. He's somebody who believes in this to the core. So this is another force that is affecting the situation there. I think it will push part of Maduro's coalition in the direction of wanting to get the respect and good relations with these Latin American left-oriented governments. I think that's a great asset for the negotiating process.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I think it's partly that, the approach that we're talking about requires people to be alert to what the new allies are for moving in this direction, and in what ways the international geopolitical situation also may be changing. I mean, after all, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a huge event in international relations. It changes the equation in terms of Latin American relations with Russia. I mean, you can't be a democratic politician in a South American country today and say, our Russian friends, our socialist allies. I mean, it's brutal what they're doing. So there's that, but there's also the flip side that the energy economy is changed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so the likelihood that Venezuela can recover, not immediately, but can begin to recover its capacity to be a major petroleum exporting country again. It has the largest reserves in the world. The thought that this might come into play again is an attractive one for the Venezuelan economy, for the U.S., for the international energy picture in general. So there are things that make one feel that the incentives are there to move in a different direction. It doesn't mean that all of Maduro's cronies are going to stay the course of being part of this. Some of them will need to be eased out one way or another for the kinds of things they've done. But that, again, is part of transitions everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's as you've made clear both today in this discussion and in the report, that it's not a magic bullet, and people should temper their expectations that things can move quickly. But on the other hand, you've looked at what at times look like a hopeless situation or an immovable object, and you've charted a way course. So congratulations to you and the group on your work in that regard. And I want to tell our viewers, you have an opportunity to read the report. It is available free of charge on the Wilson Center website. So if you go to wilsoncenter.org and you click on the Latin American Program tab, you'll be able to find this report and all the good work that Abe and all of his collaborators have done. Abe, thank you for today. Thank you for your work. And once again, great to have you back at the center, even if just virtually.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll choose to join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.